guys. Thank you so much for joining me on the first episode of the Modern Mythos podcast. I'm really excited to be here. I've been talking about doing this for a long time. If you're not familiar with me or my other output, I'm an artist and aspiring philosopher. I play guitar, piano, and I compose. If you want context to some of that, I have the links below in the description. So I wanted to just kind of get right into the thick of it because this is the first episode of the Modern Mythos podcast. And I have been thinking about a lot of things, and this podcast is going to be quite exhaustive. It is tethered to some very basic guidelines, which is interest in a philosophical perspective on history and psychology. But it's also going to be a very venal and materialistic exploration of just the rawest of my thoughts and trying to record them and get them out there. And doing this in the aftermath of the coronavirus has been probably kind of key to the development of some of the ideas I'm going to touch on. Now, I'm going to be doing both monologues and interviews with people that I'm really, really excited to talk to. And one of the things I've noticed in the last year to date this podcast, this is the June after the heyday of coronavirus. Coronavirus seems to be subsiding in the United States and elsewhere around the world. I've realized that nothing quite gives perspective to the past more than an obscured future. And you can see that this kind of exists on a bit of an intensity spectrum. It seems like when you get to the point where you have a near-death experience, the perspective that's given is intense and very, very obvious. When you have death passively announcing itself kind of in the background, you are given just a little bit more of a jolt of this perspective. And when nothing is really going wrong and when you feel completely safe, it seems like perspective is almost some sort of auxiliary observation of the world that doesn't really suit your purposes. So it is very much that traumatic experiences and fear bring us to more of an appreciation of just what historical perspective is and what philosophical perspective is. And coronavirus definitely put things in context for me, but today I wanted to just talk about the fundamentals of this podcast. And the fundamentals of this podcast are to examine myself and other people through the lens of fundamental truths about mythology and archetypes. And I will be doing both philosophical podcasts that are just very straightforward about philosophical ideas, and I will also be doing historical type podcasts that try to take a position on things and events in history. Today, I wanted to talk about the nature of knowledge and truth, and this is going to be something that I think sets up the dichotomy for everything I'm about to talk about. But I have noticed in recent years, especially in first world countries, that there's a tendency to believe that, or there's a tendency to instruct kids and instruct college students that sort of puts too much of an emphasis on task completion and mastery of subjective phenomena. And I've been asking myself whether or not education in this sense gives us a very high resolution picture of what actual knowledge is, and I think the answer is no. I think the emphasis being put on getting a passing grade is really not the thing we're looking for when we're trying to build better humans, when we're trying to build better societies, when we're trying to be more reflective on what is true in the universe. I think what we're after a lot of the times in that is a way of sort of putting humans on a gradient in a way that can propel our society. And one of the ways in which we propel our society is by putting people in these neat little boxes where you go to school, you go to college, you put on a bunch of different outfits, and you eventually end up in some profession. And what this produces a lot of the time is an underlying philosophy in human beings that is sort of fundamentally subjugates the individual to collectivist knowledge that isn't really a part of their experience. It's part of perhaps a larger shared experience of humans that is very, very diluted and presented in such a way so that we can build people who maintain our civilization. And there's nothing wrong with that. That in and of itself is good. We continuously need people who have a certain level of subjective expertise in the things that they do. But whether or not this is producing a higher resolution version of knowledge is a big question to me. And I think, since I also think that it's producing a very low resolution version of knowledge, I think that this accounts for some of the cognitive dissonance that we see, especially in politics today, which is not necessarily a topic that I go into a lot in this podcast. But it produces a sort of dichotomized thinking in people, that's one thing, and you can see it in the party structure in most of the first world, where we have these very clean dichotomies about one side and the other side. And the way you know it's true is because most of the time, if you ask someone their opinion about a highly political topic and they tell you their opinion, you can predict some other thing that they probably think. And the fact that global information exists in this way is just inappropriate. It seems like it's not really a reference to a fundamental truth. It sounds like it's more of a reference to the party materials. And I ask myself a lot, and this podcast is about, how do we get to the places where fundamental truth is more important, where we can see fundamental truth for what it actually is, and we can see absolute truth for what it absolutely is, and we can distinguish it from relativistic truths, which I would say is the body of understanding that defines most of our politicking. So today I'm just going to leave you with a short anecdote about something that happened to me the other day that I think sets the tone well for this podcast. I was outside in a field, and it was this very idyllic field, and it was perfectly well manicured. You could tell that humans had been out in it, but it was almost like this platonic version of the field that you might see in your head. And I was enjoying this field, and after about 10 seconds of really, really getting into it, I heard the sound of a muffler from a car go off, probably 100 yards away from where I was. And in that moment, my brain realized the trick of, oh, wait, I'm just in a field in the middle of human civilization. I really haven't gotten any closer to nature. And I simultaneously realized a couple of things, but one of the things I realized very quickly is, A, that I wanted to be in that unobscured version of the state of nature, and B, that it left me with the question of, is this even possible? Is this doable? And I imagined a thought experiment in the most extreme sense, because I don't think it's possible for you to get away from the metaphor of that muffler almost anywhere on Earth, even if you're in somewhere that's very isolated, that is far away from the city lights or anything like that. You still could see a plane passing by. You still would be subject to this gentle reminder that we all live on this planet. We're floating through space together, and we've done all of these things to it that have taken us away from the state of nature. So here's the thought experiment. Could you actually even get closer to the state of nature by traveling to a distant planet that was completely uninhabited? And I've concluded the answer is actually no to this question, because you would still be simply a collection of your memories and thoughts, and that would be prohibitive of you realizing any sort of transcendental state of nature that is something akin to what our ancestors would have felt. So my podcast is in some senses an attempt to get back to these states and to try to tease out the things in the human experience that make the transition that we've gone through a little bit more obvious, so that we can pull at some of the strings that can maybe unravel the things that are deeper and more fundamental in our consciousness. And I have a couple of methods of doing this already. I'm exploring more. One of the obvious ones is meditation, because what meditation does is it actually allows you to separate from the parts of yourself that the parts of the thinking self that operate on a day-to-day basis, that do the pedestrian tasks that we need to do. There are also some other things that I think are useful in this endeavor, and I will make sure that they are explained and listed in this podcast. But anyways, I want to thank you guys for joining me on the first episode of the Modern Mythos podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, whatever else, so that you catch the next episode. I'm going to be talking to Adrian Golby next week on this podcast. He's a filmmaker and guitarist and an aspiring philosopher. I'm very excited to talk to him. We have a lot in common and we have a lot to discuss. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the episode.